We are now ready to go. I will hand it over to David Thompson, who works at BWorks. He will be our moderator during this session. He will work us all over the presentation, and he will also be the one to animate the question and answer session. So thank you for joining. Thank you for being in this session. And David, I hand it over to you. Thank you all.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. And thank you, Virginie, and also to Hervé for inviting me to take part in this session. And thanks for joining everyone who's part of this breakout session from wherever you're joining us in the world today. So my name's Dave Thompson. I'm a director at BWorks Inc., which is a management consulting company in Toronto, Ontario, Canada. And we apply principles of behavioral science and behavioral economics to a range of behavior change challenges around the world. Today, we're going to talk about farmer development plans and living income with our three excellent panelists. If you already know a lot about farm development plans, then in this session will be very interesting for you. And we look forward to hearing all of the questions that I'm sure you'll have for our panelists. And if you don't know much about farm development plans or you know very little, then that's perfectly fine as well. We're actually going to begin our session with some information that Paul Masick will provide us, telling us about the key features of farm development plans and how they work. Then our panelists are going to share some best practices of farm development plans, and they'll talk to us about what successful FDPs look like, how they can have a positive impact on farmers' living income, and also we'll highlight some of the potential challenges of implementation of FDPs. So at my company, BWorks, I lead our sustainability portfolio, and I do not proclaim to be an expert in farm development plans or cocoa production, but I am a behavioral scientist. And the adoption of good agricultural practices by cocoa farmers at its core is a behavioral challenge. And the challenge of good agricultural practices, or GAPs, is that really we're talking about low-income farmers, and we're asking them to incur even greater short-term financial burden associated with things like fertilizer, replanting, and pruning. And these are certain costs that we're asking them to incur for a chance of improved yields and income in the medium to long term, which are uncertain benefits. So really, this is a classic behavioral challenge. We're all very strongly present biased, and in fact, we prefer smaller immediate rewards to larger, longer term rewards, even if those long-term rewards are a certainty. Good agricultural practices are also new behaviors for many farmers, and they take time to yield results. And we have a lot of difficulty maintaining behavior change, and we need positive reinforcement, and we need feedback in order to persist with new behaviors. There are also informational barriers to good agricultural practice adoption. Many farmers do not have the knowledge necessary to understand appropriate gap adoption and the benefits that good agricultural practices can yield. Farm development plans represent a new viable way to mitigate a lot of these behavioral and informational barriers to gap adoption. There's ongoing touch points with farmers and a data-driven approach to development plans, which hold the potential to provide a sense of progress and positive reinforcement to farmers, help them stick with the FDPs over the time frame necessary to realize meaningful benefits to crop yields. Farm development. No problem. And I'll just reiterate that to the attendees, if you could please mute yourselves. Thank you. And so farm development plans also can serve to educate farmers on good agricultural practices in a personalized and relevant way, which can help overcome some of those informational barriers. So with that, we have three excellent speakers today who are going to talk to us about different aspects of farm development plans and gap adoption amongst cocoa farmers. Paul Masick is the Associate Vice President and at Chorus International. He'll discuss the role and potential of FDPs in Latin America and the emergence of living income. Next, we'll be hearing from Sheila, who is a senior manager at iSeal Alliance, and who will talk about the role FDPs can play in helping farmers generate a living income, and among other things, suggest how living income could or should be used as a performance metric by which to judge the efficacy of farmer development plans. And then we'll hear from Jean-Marie Codillo, an entrepreneur who will provide us with a perspective on the role of farm development plans in helping improve farmers' living income and the role that coaching in farm development plans can play to professionalize producers. So with that, I will turn the floor over to Paul Masick, who again is the Senior Associate Vice President at Chorus International. He's going to kick us off by telling us about the key features of farm development plans, and then he will present his talk entitled Perspectives from Latin America on Farm Development Plans and Living Income. So Paul, I will turn the floor over to you.
My apologies, I was still on mute. Thank you very much, Dave. And good morning, good afternoon to everyone. You know, it's interesting to be here today because this straddles a little bit my current position, which is with Chorus International, which is a new nonprofit that absorbed several nonprofits, including Lutheran World Relief. And so some of my talk today will focus on our programs in Latin America with Lutheran World Relief. But what I'd like to do is start out with some work that I was involved with when I was at the World Cocoa Foundation, which was my previous employer, and I'm very pleased to be back here again. And this was some work we had done in looking specifically at the general concept of farm development plans and the evolutionary state of those plans through the different company supply chains, primarily in West Africa. So, you know, in a nutshell, a farm development plan is really an approach to supporting cocoa farmers to increase their yields in the medium to long term. And this approach combines both individualized coaching, so sort of think about it as one-on-one coaching, with customized sort of farm-specific situation, family-specific recommendations generated through a high degree of data information gathering and analysis. And so as David was saying, we're really trying to tackle both the behavioral changes that are necessary on an individual farm and with an individual farmer relative to their aspirations and goals and their investment horizon, if you will, but also ensure that they're provided with the right information at the right time. So here you can see on this graphic, we have what I would call the sort of 4 pillars of the current farm development plan that we've seen in the field. The first pillar is around farm level data collection, which is very specific, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. Then there's the customization of the plan. Often this happens through various algorithms that are predictive in nature. One could even call them artificial intelligence at some level, and they may eventually be combined with powerful AI capabilities and technology to basically take that farm level data with known productivity and yield information and project the potential return on investment from that farmer. And then, as you can imagine, any level of farm production and marketing requires a strong degree of training, coaching, and mentoring. And I think we're all very familiar with the farmer field schools, which were very dominant, which was a methodology for regrouping farmers, often around a lead farmer who would then receive a certain amount of training and impart that training to his fellow or her fellow farmers at the local level. This is a much more individualized and focused approach. And then, as you can see, it's not a short-term engagement. It's not a one-off. It's actually a continuous process of engaging and re-engaging, monitoring the status of the plan, and making tweaks and adjustments along the way. And often these four pillars are combined through a digital interface and a digital platform, either a smartphone or a tablet of some sort. Next slide. So in thinking through the implementation of the farm development plan, at least what we've seen in West Africa is that it often begins with a selection of cooperatives, a selection of farmers within those cooperatives, and then a sort of matching or pairing situation in which individual farmers and individual cooperatives are paired and linked up with coaches who in many cases could be extension agents or other individuals who are often involved in training farmers at the local level. Obviously, they need to speak the local language, understand the local context, but also have been trained in the techniques and technologies that they'll impart. Next slide. So from the farmer and cooperative selection, you then move to really the foundational element, which is collecting data, collecting quite a bit of data around the individual farm. And I think we're all aware that a farm is not, a sort of homogeneous entity. It's actually often a collection of various plots with different genetic material, different soil types, different landscapes in some cases, and different age of trees. So all of that data is very specific and important to ensuring that the algorithms that will then predict the potential yield on the investment have the accurate and right data for those plots. And that results in a sort of customized multi-year, multi-plot set of recommendations, and in some of the more sophisticated ones, a profit and loss statement, as well as even procurement actions where they go to seek inputs and services in support of their productivity plan. Next slide. Next slide. Okay, good, thank you. So after the selection of the farmers, the selection of cooperatives, and then the collection and analysis, crunching of the data, if you will, you then get often a series of recommendations. And these recommendations are around what to do on each of those plots. And that results in a set of individualized coaching topics. So you could imagine a cocoa farmer who has one plot that's very old that needs rehabilitation, perhaps another plot that's been affected by disease or pests that needs, a certain amount of maintenance and monitoring, including the use of pesticides or even eradication of some of the trees. And then in other cases, you may have young trees, young plots that actually need more maintenance and tree management. So this often results in the transfer of knowledge, the adoption of good practices by the farmers, and the improvement over time of the technical capacity of that farmer. And as I said, and we can go to the next slide, this really results in a long-term engagement around continuous coaching and improvement, continuous data collection to monitor whether some of the outputs and some of the assumptions that were generated by the plans for every individual crop hold true, every individual plot that they hold true, and then feeding that data back into the system and further customizing and refining the plan. So you could imagine in an ideal situation that over the course of 10 to 15 years, through a continuous coaching and mentorship process, an individual farmer would actually realize the full potential of their farm and the plots as per the original or the revised development plan for that particular farm. So I'll stop there. That's really just a brief overview of the structure of farm development plans. And if any of you are interested in learning more about this work that the World Cocoa Foundation had done, feel free to reach out to my colleagues, Virginie Metheng, who's on the call here, as well as Hervé Bisaleo, who's the Director of Agricultural Productivity. Let me now turn to my current role, which is as Associate Vice President at Chorus International, sometimes referred to as Lutheran World Relief. We're a nonprofit organization with quite a bit of work throughout Latin America, but also in Southeast Asia, including Indonesia, and some work in cocoa producing countries of Africa, but primarily DRC and Tanzania to a certain extent. So Dave, next slide. So we don't really have farm development plans in the current sense of what I described in West Africa, but I think there's some emerging trends in the cocoa sector in Latin America that are worth looking at and might provide a really strong foundation for building out a more robust, information-rich farm development plan and multi-year planning. As you can see here, the countries where we're active as Chorus International or Lutheran World Relief include Peru, Colombia, Guatemala, El Salvador, Honduras, Nicaragua, and Ecuador, with obviously Peru and Ecuador, and to a lesser extent, Colombia being the big powerhouse cocoa producers of Latin America. Next slide. So a lot of our work in Latin America is through a project, a 5-year program that we're running with the gracious support of the U.S. Department of Agriculture, which is called the MOCA program. It stands for Maximizing Opportunities in Cacao and Coffee in the Americas. It's led by TechnoServe, another nonprofit, and TechnoServe leads the overall program, provides the technical management and leadership in the coffee sector, and Lutheran World Relief, or Chorus International, provides leadership and oversight to the cacao sector. It's a 5-year program slated to end in 2023. You've seen the countries, the budget for cacao is approximately 11.5 million. I'll talk a little bit about how we're using those resources. And we're currently reaching about 15,000 farmers, and we're hoping to grow by the end of the program to reaching a total of 20,000 farmers. And it brings together a consortium of many stakeholders, nonprofits, farmer organizations, research institutes, including Cartier and CRC in the Caribbean, as well as many private sector companies, and I would say everything from small, medium to large cocoa and chocolate companies have been involved through our matching grant program. Next slide. So just a little bit on the cooperative structure and the role of producer groups. So I think you've seen in the Farm Development Plan, cooperatives play a very important role in providing that first access to individual farmers. And that's very true in Latin America. I mean, it's not uncommon for farmers to come together to negotiate better prices, to aggregate their yields, grossing that up and then marketing it to the extent that they can. They often come together to access input and better services. And they may also come together not infrequently to access government programs and support provided through nonprofits, donors, and government programs. And then they're also always looking to access international markets and make market connections with buyers and exporters of the products. A few examples of these, what I would call apex organizations in Latin America include App Cacao of Peru, FENAPRACADO in Honduras, and Unicase in Ecuador, which is a large sort of second-tier cooperative with over 14 base level cooperatives spread throughout the country. Next slide. So in terms of the potential for farm development plans, I believe in Latin America, the basic building blocks are there. First, you have strong cooperatives. In many cases, they're already providing a lot of services and support to their members. And they would be very interested in, and in many cases, always looking to expand the kind of services and support they can provide. The good agricultural practices, Dave, that you were referring to, and the related curriculum and the training methodologies, as well as extension agents, are all in place. In many cases, often it's a combination of public sector, quasi-public sector, as well as private sector extension, sometimes provided through companies. There's a high degree of digitization, and actually with this COVID crisis, I think all of us can appreciate, and it's ironic to even say it on this call today, the degree to which digitization and moving to information-based technology and communication has really grown, and I think that trend is going to only continue. You've also begun to see a rollout of digital farm services, everything from the mapping of the farms, which I should mention is one of the foundational sets of data collection that accompany that early stage data collection for the farm development plans. Without a farm map, it's very hard to provide specific recommendations to a farmer. SMS, analog, and smart messaging communication, we see a lot of videos, the use of WhatsApp groups, and the like are really growing and blossoming. You also see an increase in people accessing PDF and other digital resources online. And then through our work with the MOCA project, we've focused a lot on improving financial management and training cooperatives and farmers to improve their financial management, which I think actually has to go hand in hand with farm development plans. And then another area that we've really focused on is raising awareness around gender and the gender dimensions of cocoa production and marketing, and farm management for that matter. Next slide. So just a brief overview. These are some of the technology platforms that we've rolled out in the context of our work. We have Cacao Mobile, which is mobile cocoa curriculum deployable on a smartphone. It includes documentation. It includes self-assessments around gender. We've also been working on a very interesting sort of virtual cacao extension agent called Edgar, who you could pull up on a phone, type a question into, and then Edgar, which is really just a virtual agent, would search out and find the answer to your question and provide it back to you. And then you can also see the use of cocoa-based SMS, mapping of plots, and cost management. Next slide. So here, you can't see it very well, but these are some of the web-based interfaces. So many of the mobile apps actually run on the back end, which is a web interface. So a lot of the resources that would be available on a smartphone are actually also replicated and available on websites. And we can definitely share that with you and provide you with more information. Next slide. So I was asked a question around, performance indicators and living income. And, I would say we're starting to see the use of good performance indicators in the cocoa sector. I think the cocoa sector is not as large in Latin America as it is in West Africa, but we're starting to see a really good, sort of aggregation of those figures and improvement of the quality of that data at a national level, or even within various platforms, some of which are both public and private. Regarding the question on living income, I think it's a hot topic and a big priority. People are very focused on it. Latin America has been fortunate to take advantage of some work that was done in other commodities, including bananas and coffee, on benchmarking living income. So I think there's a certain methodological and comfort level. What you see in several Latin America countries, though, is a continued focus on sort of the minimum wage necessary for a rural inhabitant. So many of the national information systems are actually geared to, assessing sort of national statistics to what extent people are earning a satisfactory income relative to the gazetted minimum wage, for example, which is a little different than what we see again in the living income debate in West Africa. And then I would add, Chorus International also has a social impact investment arm. I'm not directly responsible for it, but I work very closely with them. It's called Ground Up Investing. And one of our impact investees is a small innovative company called Uncommon Cacao. And they take this sort of radical approach to transparency in which they actually try and price their purchase of cocoa based on the actual cost of production. So they do a cost of production analysis, they add a reasonable profit margin on top of that, and then that becomes the basis for negotiating the sales price for those products and their purchasing price, which again is a very interesting approach and sort of, definitely is very different to what we see in the bulk markets, especially around cocoa being set by a futures price. Next slide. So just a couple comments on gender. Lutheran World Relief's long had a focus on gender. As I said, through our Cocoa Mobile app, we developed a very interesting toolkit that allows farmers and cooperatives to sort of go through a step-by-step self-assessment and diagnosis process, which could look at various aspects of gender within their own work and within their own cooperative activities. And then it sort of, again, kicks out a series of recommendations. As you can imagine, the biggest challenge is, of course, implementing those recommendations and making difficult decisions. But we found that many of the companies and the NGOs and other programs active in the cocoa sector can accompany and support those cooperatives and those farmers as they seek to make their changes. So I think, if I'm not mistaken, next slide, that should be my last slide. I've talked for a long time, so Dave, I'm going to hand it back to you, and I'm happy to take any questions during the discussion period.
Great, thank you so much, Paul. And Virginie, if we can go ahead one more slide in the presentation. So I'm just going to remind everyone that please keep submitting your questions on the Zoom chat. We will get to all of the questions after our three speakers have presented in a Q&A, and I'll moderate that discussion. So we are seeing your questions, and please keep submitting them as you listen to our speakers. So thanks again, Paul, and thank you for introducing the concept of farmer development plans and talking about the key attributes prior to your presentation. Next, we're going to hear from Sheila Senetharaja, the Senior Manager at ISEAL. So Sheila, I'm going to turn the floor over to you, and I'm going to mute myself once again.
Great. Thanks a lot, Dave. So hello, everyone, and thank you for having me to present here. It's okay, we can go to the next slide. As Dave said, my name is Sheila, and I'm from ISEAL Alliance. ISEAL Alliance is a membership organization for credible sustainability standards. My role within ISEAL is primarily to look at strategies that drive the uptake of sustainable practices. But an additional role that I play is also to facilitate the Living Income Community of Practice platform. Now, for those of you who may not be familiar with the Living Income Community of Practice platform, you can see the logo, I've put it there on the top right-hand side. It is an open platform that was founded by GIZ, ISEAL, and Sustainable Food Lab back in 2015. And as Paul had mentioned, living income has become sort of a topic that people are, it's growing in momentum, and people are beginning to recognize it and talk about it more. So the Living Income Community of Practice, it really is to sort of house that sort of conversation on living income. Our main objectives within the community of practice is to build awareness on the concept of living income, provide clarity and guidance on measuring income, because it can be quite complex. There are different indicators you can use and how you would measure that, as well as to discuss and have a better understanding of the strategies to close the income gap. And today, in today's presentation, I'll be representing the living income community of practice and talking about farmer development plans and the impact and the link to living income. Next slide, please. So with that, let me just start, before we get into farmer development plans, let me just start with living income, because that's ultimately the outcome that we want to see for producers to be able to earn a better level of income. What are the key elements that actually influence income? Let's start from here. So you can see here, I've put there, you have productivity, price, diversification, and cost of production. And these are the key elements that can actually trigger and influence income. But underpinning this is the enabling environment. And the enabling environment is super critical in ensuring the effectiveness of any strategy or intervention to influence income. And I believe in the first few sessions for the WCF partnership meetings, have highlighted and talked about the enabling environment already. You click next. So let's see, what is the reality today? For the past 10 plus years, a number of approaches to raise income levels have been focused at the farm level. And a lot of this have zoomed in on productivity. And, rightfully so, if we increase productivity, we hope that that will also increase the income of farmers. Has this worked? It has provided some positive impact on productivity and increasing yields, but the issue is increasing profitability of farmers is a far more complex challenge. Now, if we just take a step back and we look at income and income levels of producers, it is a very complex issue. And if we want to address and be able to influence income, we can't just focus on one strategy or one intervention. We need a more holistic approach to dealing with this. We need to be able to put in place a system that is adaptable to the local context, weighing in, what are some of the enabling, what are some of the disabling factors. And, we ultimately, what we want to have is we want to be able to ensure that any system that we put in place is going to be supportive towards the producer being able to make his own decisions on his farm. And that requires different types of support. It requires us not just putting in place direct interventions, but also ensuring that there is that sort of enabling environment that promotes the uptake of these kind of practices. Next slide, please. So with that, let me just provide some context to what we mean by living income, because having a good understanding of the context is really the first step in ensuring that we have the right strategies in place to address this. So very quickly, I'm just going to talk you through this graphic. It was produced by the Living Income Community of Practice, and really just to provide that clarity for us to just think through this a little bit better. The background behind this graphic really is there have been numerous research that's been done over the last couple of years on, what constitutes a living income, what is actual income, and I'm going to walk you through this now. So on the left-hand side, you'll see what we call a living income benchmark. And a living income benchmark is really the cost of a basic and decent standard of living for a household. And the components of what constitutes the living income benchmark is food, decent housing, essential needs, and a buffer for unexpected events. So this really sets it apart from, just looking at poverty lines as a measure to tackle poverty. We're going beyond the notion of survival and saying, producers should be able to earn a level of income that enables them to be resilient and able to withstand any unexpected events that may come by, like drought or the pandemic that we're facing right now. So I do want to say that not everyone, to produce living income benchmarks, it is a very resource and cost heavy thing to produce, and you don't always need a benchmark. It is and can be used as a reference to know how far we are from the gap, because if you want to understand where we are in this journey of tracking farmers' income, we have to know, what's the sort of reference point. So a living income benchmark provides a sort of reference. It should never be used as a starting point. We do want farmers to be able to earn a sustainable livelihood that goes on increasing, but this does provide a sort of a reference. Can I click on next? So the one thing I want to highlight here, which will sort of relate back to the farmer development plan, sorry, we are talking about household income. So as different from wages, and those of you who are familiar with living wage, and as Paul has mentioned just now, living income is talking about a household income. So we are looking at what is that basic but standard, the basic level of income that is required for a household. Now, on the right-hand side is what the reality is. What is the actual income of a farmer? What are the components that make up the actual income of a farmer? And this is very important because, as you can see here, what makes up the actual income of a farmer is not just the farm income, but there's also the net of farm income and other sources of income. So it's made up of multiple components. Further to this, if you look at just the farm income, you can see the primary crop. In this case, we're talking about cocoa. That is just one component of the entire farm income. Now, there have been studies that have been done by organizations like KIT that have shown that where farmers are from the living income benchmark is 50%. It's just half of that. And the primary crop is something like 60% of the household income. So if you're thinking about any strategy to intervene and influence income, and if you're only focused on one crop, cocoa, for example, in this case, and you're only taking one intervention on productivity, you can imagine the impact that that's going to have on the overall household income is going to be quite limited. Not to say there will be some impact, but it will be limited. And so these components are very important to understand as we go forward to put in place any strategy to influence income levels of household. So household, multi-components make up household income, and primary crop is just one component of farm income. Next slide, please. So I'm not going to go into what constitutes a farm development plan, because I think Paul has really emphasized that really well. And to me, when I look at this term, a farm development plan to me really is a sort of a farm management system almost, because on the one side, we want farmers to have a good understanding of the conditions of their farm. And then we want to, complement that with the personalized coaching and regular monitoring. But in addition to that, we want to have that tailored support back to the farmers. And if we think about, sustainable farming, this is all about soil fertility management, good agricultural practices, as well as things like planting materials and inputs that go into a farm. So if producers, and I know in earlier conversations, we've looked at where cocoa is produced. If producers are already earning such a low level of income right now, how are we expecting them to put investments into their farm to actually build and rejuvenate their farms? I mean, something doesn't add up here. And that is why I mentioned in the slide before this, the enabling environment has to be there. It has to be strong enough for these kind of plans to actually take place. So if you say, are farmer development plans the best way forward? It's only as good as, the conditions that we create and make it possible for this to be taken up. So ISIL, or the Living Income Community of Practice, we don't run farmer development plans, but I would like to highlight a couple of points that regularly keep coming up in the discussions that we have within the community of practice. So if you can click next. And some of the points that I want to raise here. One, if we see, what influence, what makes up the components of household income is beyond just the primary crop. And if you as a producer that's focused on cocoa, how do you account for the non-cocoa insights? How do you get those non-cocoa product insights? Two, we also see that, just looking at this, personalized coaching, regular monitoring, tailored support, investment that has to go in, be it financial or technical. How do you scale this up effectively? I mean, in a cost-effective manner? These are questions that still need to be answered. You can do it for some, but how do you do it for the hundreds and thousands of farmers that are out there? And then three, are all farmers ready? And where do you target your initial investment? So these are some of the key points. And again, these have been raised, and I feel like this conversation is still ongoing, and that there's a space to have these kind of conversations. Next slide, please. And so I want to touch on a few things, but I'm not going to go into it too in detail, because again, I think Paul has clearly talked about some of this already in his presentation. But data, and as he said, I really feel if we want farmer development plans to actually be effective in what they're doing, the availability of data, good quality data, and robust, accurate data is really important. And so you can collect it from the farm through farmer field books, digital tools, has been mentioned. There are also ways to use secondary data, and that's something that we're currently talking a lot in the living income community of practice, just how do you measure incomes as well. So we have some frameworks and guidance available for how foundational guidance that are produced by the community of practice on how organizations can use secondary data and what data sets are there to calculate living income. Of course, modeling approaches are also there, as Paul mentioned. So some organizations are doing that to fill in the gap areas, and these are good things. But the one more point I wanted to talk about data is so many organizations are out there running programs, farmer programs. There's a lot of data that they're collecting. And I would like to make a shout out to say, let's use these sort of pre-competitive platforms that are available to share that information. These studies have enabled us as a community of practice to come up with these graphics that we make available to everyone as well. And it's this kind of information that we really need to strengthen farmer development plans. It's a good approach, but really it takes more than just a good idea to make it possible. Very quickly on enabling environment, that is super important, as I've mentioned, not just focus at the farmer development plan itself, but just more broadly, if you have these enabling factors in the context that you're operating in, it is going to counter affect whatever you put in. So engagement in sector platforms, discussions like this at the WCF with policymakers, strengthening the regulations and the systems on the ground really would be helpful. Also, just that access to service delivery, bringing the finance and the investment sector in would be good. Now, scaling up, I talked a little bit about scaling up, and I just want to say that one of the things that is essential to a farmer development plan is this monitoring and tracking of performance over time. So what indicators are we using to do that? And this is also a thing that you see a lot of frameworks being developed right now. And I'm just going to give one example with standard systems, because we work closely with standard systems. Rainforest Alliance, they have this program that they've done, which is Farm Grow. They've now used those indicators and built it into their standard systems. So this is one way that we can build and have indicators that are able to track and monitor progress over time. Quantitative living income benchmarks. Again, as I mentioned, having references of where we think farmers should be earning, at least at the very least, not the target, but just that would be very good to at least push us to think about how much more we need to do to get there. And finally, I want to touch on farmer segmentation, not farmer segmentation, but really, how do we approach or see which farmers are ready for this? Of course, when you put in place something like this, you do want to ensure that you're targeting farmers that are ready for this. Not all farmers are the same. Again, I'm not from the cocoa sector. I'm more from the palm sector in my previous job as well. But I think the context is very similar. Every farmer is different. There's some that are invested in their farms and they live on their farms. There's some farmers who have multiple jobs, some who lease their lands out. You have sharecroppers and tenant farmers. So starting with a small group of farmers which are ready for this and are willing and want to committed to this is also important. But I also want to say that, this is an opportunity for us to reach out to other groups that previously maybe we didn't target. So gender inclusion, the youth, we could see farmer development plans as a way to sort of bring those groups in. We've already seen studies that have been done that programs with women do have a positive impact on income. So this would be one way that we could see as, just making that more gender inclusive. Next slide, please. So I'm going to just show just 2 more slides on just an example. One is this from Rainforest Alliance, and I'm not going to go through the concept of the plan itself, but because we're talking about the link to living income, I do want to make one point here. With this program from Rainforest Alliance, you can see, not on the left side, on the right side, the graph. When does farmer income, the green line, through this Farm Grow program, when you begin to actually see a positive improvement in farm income, and that happens around year 7, and fully the benefits are really fully realized somewhere around year 12. So the key point here is that it takes a long-term commitment and investment before we can realize income levels. So that's one point. Next slide, please. So this is the one I mentioned about the living income community of practice. And I do want to say, we are an open space, open to any organization that wants to talk about farm livelihoods. And within that, we talk about different aspects that contribute to that. The point that I was mentioning just now was on measurement and how to use measurement. There are a lot of available resources, and please do visit the website, because particularly in data and how to use frameworks using secondary data sources is the key thing that I want to raise here. And finally, my last slide. So just some key takeaway messages. I do want to highlight and stress better understanding of context. I think everything that is being done, the studies that are happening right now, it does help us think better about the strategies. So it is a bit of a, if you want this sort of systemic change, we need to keep going back and forth a bit, build on the context, share the data, improve our strategies, come back to the drawing block and keep going in that cycle until we can get it going. Stop working in silos. So this is just really just a shout out where we have studies that are available and data available. Let's try and have an open space where we can share this. Shared responsibility. We have to stop looking at this as a approach and an intervention that the farmer has to pick up, and he has to bear the burden of the risk of the changes that he has to make. But we have to look at how all organizations have to come in and create that sort of enabling environment. If not, this is not going to work. And then the last point is on just the indicators and aligning on those indicators to take us forward. And yeah, that's all from my end. I hope that was not too long. Sorry, over to you, Dave.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Sheila. That was very interesting. I really like this concept of the enabling environment and really pointing out the complex relationship between yield and profitability and how that takes time to unfold. Also, as a behavioral scientist, I really like hearing people advocate for metrics and good quality data in program evaluation. So thank you very much. So the third speaker that we will have in our panel today is Jean-Marie Quadio from DG Agronova Saro. So I will now turn it over to you, Jean-Marie, to give your presentation.
Ok. Bonjour tout le monde. C'est Jean-Marie Guadio, jeune entrepreneur agricole. C'est bon, tout le monde entend? Ah.
C'est bon, on vous entend.
Ok. Je pense que vu la hauteur des différents intervenants avant moi, je pense que ils ont fait plus ou moins, ils ont fait le tour de tout ce qu'il y a comme information concernant les femmes development plan, les femmes development plan. Parce que nous, en tant que producteurs, toutes ces mesures-là sont prises pour que à la fin, nous soyons les bénéficiaires. Mon intervention va porter sur qu'est-ce que nous, en tant que producteurs, nous pensons de ces plans de développement et est-ce qu'ils peuvent améliorer plus ou moins nos revenus. Bon, pour ma part, allô, j'espère qu'on m'entend. J'ai l'impression que ma connexion rame.
We can hear you perfectly well, Jean-Marie.
Ok, ok. Donc, comme je disais tout à l'heure, en tant que producteur, toutes ces mesures, toutes ces approches sont faites dans l'optique que nous puissions améliorer nos revenus, notre productivité et au final avoir une vie décente issue de notre, à partir des revenus de notre activité agricole. Donc, dans un premier temps, nous allons dire ce que nous pensons de ces plans de développement et aussi si cela impacte réellement nos revenus. Et en second plan, nous allons parler de l'approche, quel le coaching qui est vraiment novateur dans le cadre des plans de développement. Et si cela permet de professionnaliser les entrepreneurs agricoles que nous sommes. Et en dernier point, nous verrons est-ce que nous verrons si il faut une taille minimum d'exploitation pour pouvoir bénéficier de cette nouvelle approche qu'est le plan de développement agricole. Donc, pour ce qui concerne les plans de développement, je pense que M. Paul Maffec a été plus ou moins assez large. Il a dit comment est-ce que ça fonctionne, mais de notre point de vue, nous pensons que c'est une approche inclusive vu qu'elle met au centre le producteur que nous sommes en lui donnant toutes les différentes informations qui sont nécessaires à la conduite d'une exploitation. Mais surtout, on n'est pas dans un schéma où les informations viennent et qu'il n'y a pas d'interaction. Dans cette approche, il y a de l'interaction. Le producteur a son mot à dire, il apprécie en fonction de ses réalités et ça lui permet de mieux affiner ses décisions. Donc, les plans de développement, c'est une approche novatrice parce que d'abord, elle apporte des informations concernant les bonnes pratiques agricoles, la gestion même de l'exploitation et la gestion financière des revenus de l'exploitation. Parce que c'est vrai, on peut avoir des revenus issus de notre activité, mais pour pouvoir vivre véritablement, avoir une vie décente, il faut pouvoir gérer ces revenus-là. Et très souvent, les producteurs, dans leur grande majorité, n'ont pas de notion de gestion financière, de gestion de ménage, et tous ces aspects-là sont pris en compte dans les plans de développement, ce qui les rend à notre avis, une approche vraiment intéressante. Voilà. Maintenant, ce qui concerne l'impact sur les revenus des producteurs, je pense que l'impact, il est clair. Même si à lui seul ne peuvent pas réellement définir une assurance de revenus pour le producteur, vu que le prix du cacao n'implique pas les producteurs eux-mêmes. La fixation des prix n'implique pas les producteurs eux-mêmes, les producteurs que nous sommes. Et aussi, souvent, c'est en inadéquation avec les difficultés que nous rencontrons sur le terrain. Mais dans la grande majorité, pour ce qui est des données que nous maîtrisons, qui sont telles que la productivité, et la gestion des revenus issus de notre activité, les plans de développement sont intéressants parce qu'ils apportent tous ces outils de gestion qui permettent aux producteurs que nous sommes de mieux gérer, de mieux planifier ses activités, donc de pouvoir mieux gérer les revenus pour faciliter notre vie quotidienne. J'ai l'impression que ma connexion rame. Je ne sais pas si vous m'entendez. Veuillez, mon écran est figé.
Oh, we can hear you. You're coming through clearly.
OK. Donc, nous étions, tout à l'heure, nous avons mentionné l'impact que les plans de développement pouvaient avoir sur nos revenus. Voilà, donc on va passer à la deuxième phase qui était que, est-ce que ces plans à travers le coaching étaient la meilleure approche pour les producteurs? Effectivement, parce qu'avant ces approches-là, dans le cas de la Côte d'Ivoire, on a des techniciens agricoles, on a l'ANADER, on a tous ces techniciens qui accompagnent les producteurs dans leur activité, mais seulement ces actions-là n'étaient pas des actions ciblées, ce n'était pas personnalisé, c'était des actions plus ou moins générales. Mais avec l'approche de Farm Development Plan, je pense que on est plus dans une approche personnalisée qui tient compte de la réalité de chaque producteur en fonction de son exploitation, des réalités de son exploitation, et en lui permettant de pouvoir définir, de pouvoir faire ressortir les difficultés auxquelles il doit faire face et définir des solutions qu'il implique lui-même. Donc, je dirais que les FDP c'est une approche intéressante pour vous aider au producteur parce que, en plus de lui donner les informations, en plus de donner la formation sur les bonnes pratiques agricoles, les informations concernant la gestion financière, la gestion de ses revenus, les informations concernant l'environnement même de la cacaoculture et tout ce qu'il y a comme débouché sur les diversifications et tout, elle lui apporte ces informations, mais en même temps, elle lui donne les outils pour pouvoir utiliser ces informations, les mettre en pratique. Et le coaching, c'est cela, ça crée, ça déclenche la prise de décision qui implique essentiellement le producteur. Il se sent impliqué, c'est un engagement. Donc, après cet instant-là, il y a la résistance aux nouvelles pratiques et autres là est brisée parce qu'il y voit l'intérêt qu'il a à le faire et voilà. Donc, pour finir, je pense que ici, on a parlé de savoir si est-ce qu'il fallait une taille minimale pour qu'un producteur puisse bénéficier des plans de développement. Non, pour ma part, non. Mais pour notre expérience, ma petite expérience en tant que producteur, vu que je suis producteur élite dans le Nestlé Coco Plan, là-bas, à l'entame, il nous fallait avoir une superficie plus ou moins autour de 7 hectares. Parce que, bon, en fonction des productions à l'hectare, la moyenne nationale, avec ça, au moins, un producteur pouvait pouvoir vivre décemment. Seulement, aujourd'hui, je pense qu'après avoir expérimenté cette approche, je pense qu'on ne devrait pas limiter, il ne devrait pas avoir de taille minimum. Un producteur, c'est un producteur. Même s'il a 1 hectare et qu'il a les outils, et, il a tous les outils de bonnes pratiques agricoles, de gestion et tout. Ça peut lui ouvrir l'esprit. Aujourd'hui, dans le cas des FDP, on parle de diversification. Il peut être amené à mener d'autres activités qui ne sont pas forcément liées, qui ne sont pas forcément à la cacaoculture, mais qui font qu'il n'arrête pas son activité de production de cacao. Parce que ça lui permet de jongler entre les activités, les deux activités, sans toutefois vivre en deçà de ses besoins. Voilà, donc en somme, voilà plus ou moins ce que nous comprenons des Farm Development Plan. Et puis tout à l'heure, Madame Sheila a dit qu'il fallait aussi prendre en compte les jeunes. Parce que avant avant que les FDP puissent être effectifs en termes de résultats, il faut que le producteur soit ouvert à la technologie. Aujourd'hui, on parle de collection de données, des data, de l'outil numérique, informatique. Il n'est pas aisé pour en Côte d'Ivoire où la moyenne d'âge des producteurs est autour de 45 ans. Il n'est pas aisé pour une population qui a un bas niveau, je parle de la population productrice de cacao, qui a un bas niveau d'alphabétisation, de pouvoir utiliser aisément tous ces outils informatiques. Mais aujourd'hui, si on s'adresse aux jeunes pour résorber le problème de l'emploi, qui est un problème récurrent dans nos pays, donc, ces jeunes-là, ils sont éduqués, ils sont ouverts à comment on appelle ça, aux nouvelles technologies. Voilà, et ça permet d'assurer la relève. Moi-même, j'en suis l'exemple, vu que moi, je suis allé à l'école, j'ai fait mes études, j'ai fait la comptabilité et je me suis reconverti à l'agriculture, vu que, bon, en Côte d'Ivoire, la majorité des familles sont plus ou moins ont une base agricole. Voilà, c'est vrai que c'est des parents agriculteurs qui mettent leurs enfants à l'école dans la grande majorité. Et après les études, très souvent, les gens ont du mal à revenir à l'agriculture. Donc, ça fait que l'activité qui a servi à les scolariser meurt d'elle-même, et faute de relève. Donc, nous inscrivons dans la transformation ou dans la motivation pour les jeunes à revenir à l'agriculture afin de pérenniser, parce que tout cela va pérenniser la production dans la durabilité. Voilà, et il est très important de vraiment impliquer davantage les jeunes dans ces Farm Development Plan et de montrer l'intérêt qu'il y a aujourd'hui à produire du cacao. Parce qu'une activité qui n'arrive pas à rémunérer réellement les acteurs n'attire pas. Donc, nous, dans notre vision, il est question de promouvoir des success stories, de sorte à pouvoir attirer davantage les jeunes, parce qu'aujourd'hui, comme le disons, il y a des jeunes producteurs de cacao, il va falloir les cibler. Aujourd'hui, nous avons une plateforme de jeunes producteurs de cacao, et c'est important qu'à travers ces jeunes, à travers ces success stories, des jeunes qui implémentent les FDP, qui arrivent à vraiment maîtriser leur activité, intéresser d'autres jeunes à l'agriculture, à retourner, à pouvoir pérenniser cette activité-là. Voilà, donc je vous remercie et j'espère avoir été plus ou moins large dans mes explications. Voilà, mon intervention est pas assez poussée de façon technique, vu que bon, le travail technique a été déjà fait en amont par M. Paul, Masek et Sheila. Voilà, avec les différentes informations qu'ils ont pu donner. Nous, c'était beaucoup plus axé sur, en tant que producteur, quelles sont nos impressions et tout ça qu'on a de tous ces différents plans. Donc, en somme, on pourra dire que les FDP sont une vraie approche et ils sont à promouvoir pour pouvoir pérenniser la production du cacao et la rentabilité du cacao. Merci.
Thank you very much, Jean-Marie, for sharing your perspective with everyone. That was very interesting, and particularly like the point about it's not just about improving income, it's also about income management for farmers as well. Very interesting. So this is the part of the session where we're going to move into our Q&A discussion with the panelists. And if you still have questions or if anything occurs to you as we're listening to the panelists, please keep adding them to the chat in Zoom, and I'll try and get to as many of them as possible. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to start off the question and answer period. This is a question that I'll open up to all of the panelists, but we'll start with Paul's thoughts on the following question. So farm development plans really are about tailoring this approach between coaches and mentors and the farmers, which is a little bit different than the sort of farmer field school approach. And with all these increased touch points, potential implications to cost, is the tailored or one-on-one nature of farmer development plans a threat to its scalability? I think that's a fair way to phrase that.
Yeah, that's an excellent question, Dave, and I would agree. I think, you know, any time you're rapidly increasing costs by, more frequent interactions, longer interactions, more specialized interactions, run the risk of, begging the question, who's going to support that cost, right? Obviously, the farmer, in many cases, is not necessarily directly supporting that cost and may not be seeing any of those costs at all. It may be entirely subsidized by their cooperative or the buyer or even the government, to the extent to which extension agents and extension messages is coming through. I would argue that once we get, and I don't think we're there yet, but once we get to the evidence that shows that this methodology, farm development plans, and this rich, heavy touch point focus on training and mentoring does yield the kind of results we want, let's say move to a living income or even push farmers beyond a living income, then obviously it becomes a question of, we have to meet that cost. How are we going to meet it? And there, I think, is where creativity will need to come in terms of costing, cost recovery, and pricing plans. I mean, I could envision a world in which, some of the products that might be sold, whether they're financial products or inputs or, pesticides, fertilizers, could be sponsored by companies to a certain extent. I could also see a degree to which, if farmers are genuinely benefiting and generating more income and value from their involvement in a farm development plan, that they themselves contribute more. I could also see a group approach in which cooperatives bear part of the cost. So I think ultimately, if it is successful, and we have yet to see that in sort of real clear terms, you're going to be looking at a cost sharing methodology and splitting those costs across multiple actors in the system. I think Sheila raised the question of how many farmers are ready for farm development plan, and that then becomes an additional cost question, which is, how do you support other farmers who may not voluntarily, or given their level of production or sophistication, be interested or be able to enter a farm development plan? That's a bigger question.
Thank you, Paul. And Sheila, do you have anything you'd want to add to Paul's comments, or do you see the potential cost of farmer development plans as a major threat to their scalability or uptake?
So I think there's a lot of value in farmer development plans. It is customized to the needs of the producer, and it puts the sort of it empowers the producer themselves to make a decision about their own farm. And I think that there's a big appeal to that. Producers don't want someone coming and telling them what they should do with their own land. And that, I think, is really the benefit there. And I think one thing, that we should look at is, again, I come back to the enabling environment. I feel there are some groups that are already invested in this and want to do this, and they do see that, there has to be this shared responsibility, but I think more have to come in and sort of think about what role they can play to affect change, and how they can bring these kind of plans to life. So there's a lot to do with the service delivery, the technical input, and finance going back in. And I completely agree with Paul. We need to get a little bit creative with some of these, thinking about some of the solutions that we can put in place. Again, I just reflect back on the work that I used to do with palm farmers, just looking at costs. We know that some producers can't afford it. Upfront costs, having cash in hand, it's very high. But maybe don't use pesticides, find more organic ways of doing things. So there are ways that you can find around things, but I think we need to just come collectively together and make that work. The other point, again, is, just the data. So we don't have to have all farmers collecting data on the ground. I think if we can get to a space where we're utilizing data sets that are available, maybe we can make this available to more farmers and cut sort of the costs in developing this plan. So there are many ways I feel that we haven't yet talked about and explored, and that is what we should be trying to do as we move forward with this. But I do see a lot of potential for farmer development plans just because of what it can give back to the producer and take the burden off him.
Great. And Jean-Marie, you mentioned that there does not need to be a minimum size of farm for farmer development plans. So how do you have a perspective on whether the potential costs associated with farm development plans impacts the size of farm that would be suitable for this type of program, specifically with respect to the costs?
Bon, je pense que d'un premier temps, l'approche, comme Mme Sheila l'a dit, il y a déjà des groupes qui ont déjà investi, qui ont déjà commencé ce travail sur le terrain. D'un premier temps, c'est de savoir comment est-ce que cela va être répandu. Parce que, comme on dit, c'est un coaching personnalisé et autres, sur la base du grand nombre de producteurs de cacao. Je pense que d'un premier temps, en termes de coûts, il sera difficile de couvrir tous les producteurs avec le premier système qui est mis en place. Nous, par exemple, avec notre expérience, l'objectif, c'est de former des producteurs leaders. Ces producteurs leaders dans leur localité partagent l'expérience avec d'autres producteurs qui ne nécessitent plus forcément. Par exemple, nous, dans notre cadre, moi à mon exploitation, fait 100 hectares. Sur les 100 hectares, j'ai 25 hectares de cacao. Et les 25, après avoir suivi le programme de producteurs leaders avec l'approche FDP, j'arrive maintenant à pouvoir prendre des décisions, avoir certaines données qui sont miennes maintenant, parce que c'est bien appréhendé à travers le coaching et tout. Maintenant, suite à cette formation, moi, qu'est-ce que je fais? Dans mon environnement immédiat, vu qu'il y a d'autres producteurs, cette approche ne peut pas être forcément faite individuellement pour les autres producteurs. Mais moi, en tant que producteur leader, vu qu'il y a les coopératives et tout, donc en tant que producteur leader, je partage ces connaissances-là au quotidien par rapport aux challenges que mes compères dans mon environnement rencontrent et tout. Et je leur sers plus ou moins de modèle. Et je pense que cette approche-là permettra de réduire les coûts en termes d'implémentation à grande échelle. Voilà. Donc ça, c'est ma première approche. Maintenant, pour ce qui est de la taille de l'exploitation, comme on l'a dit, j'ai dit qu'il n'était pas nécessaire de fixer une taille pour que les gens aient accès à la connaissance, aient accès aux différents outils de prise de décision. Parce que aujourd'hui, moi, j'ai 25 hectares, je peux ne pas être performant avec mes 25 hectares, malgré les données que j'ai et tout. Quelqu'un qui a moins de 7 hectares peut être performant dans la mesure où il a assimilé effectivement toutes les données que les FDPs lui permettent d'avoir. Et à côté de son exploitation de cacao, il peut faire son élevage de poulets et autres qui lui permet de maintenir son exploitation et aussi de vivre décemment sans forcément vouloir abandonner l'activité ou chercher à agrandir son exploitation qui va être un impact, par exemple, parce que dans les FDP, on parle d'environnement, on parle de protection de la déforestation et tous ces aspects des choses. Donc, fixer une taille, ça serait amener ceux qui ont des petites exploitations à vouloir agrandir leurs exploitations, c'est ce qu'on ne veut pas. Actuellement, c'est plus rajeunir les vieilles plantations, ça c'est un. Et puis de deux, créer des activités des activités connexes qui ne nécessitent pas forcément la déforestation et autres. Vu qu'on sait que, par exemple, pour faire du cacao, il faut une terre qui est vraiment en bonne santé pour pouvoir espérer une certaine productivité. J'espère que ma réponse est réussie.
Thank you for everyone's perspective on that. We have quite a few questions from the audience members, so I'm gonna go through those. We'll try and get through as many as we can. I'll open this one up for all three panelists. what options are available for farmer development plans in situations of very low literacy rates among farmers? And second point to this question is, what is the role of women in farmer development plans? Paul, you mentioned a little bit about gender in your talk, so maybe we'll start with you if you have a perspective on this issue of literacy and the role of women in farmer development plans.
Yeah, thank you very much. Excellent questions. I agree. I think, you know, the issue of literacy in farm development plans is a big barrier and a potential obstacle. Obviously, and I think Jean-Marie mentioned it, that the youth in areas, you know, to the extent that they're literate and technologically literate, you know, conversant with, you know, information technology, whether it's a smartphone or a tablet, they can play a critical role in helping to be an interface between the farmer and the coach, or they themselves might be in a position of being the coach. I've seen systems that use icons and iconography work very well. I think the question of literacy also comes back to, you know, this question of, you know, wide scale and widely available cell phone technology. I mean, everyone has cell phones and everyone has access to cell phones. And at some level, they all figure out how to use them, whether it's directly themselves or through a family member or through some informed individual in the community who they trust and with whom they can help utilize the technology. So I think when there's a service that's of value and needed, people will figure out a way to exploit it and take advantage of it. So while it may be an obstacle at some level, I think there are workarounds and ways to overcome it. We've seen that in the growth of cell phone and information technology throughout the world. But I do think that basic training and support to farmers and farming communities to raise their literacy levels, their literacy with technology and phones is very critical. And I think also, you know, obviously improving the overall educational environment in rural areas is critical to supporting people to engage in these new technology and technological interfaces.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Sheila or Jean-Marie, anything to add on what options are available in situations of low literacy, and maybe comment on the role of women in farm development plans?
Yeah, I think maybe just, I think Paul's already explained really well on the... Sorry, shall I go?
Go ahead.
Yeah, sorry, on literacy, so I'll just touch on the women aspect. I think there needs to be more ways that we bring women into it. They do a lot of the farming work already, and I think just making sure that these programs are designed to tap into that would be a plus point here. So I think that's just women and youth to ensure this is this then becomes successful is one of the ways that we can look at.
Great. And Jean-Marie, do you have a perspective on the role women can play in farm development plans?
Oui, effectivement, parce que aujourd'hui, dans le FDP même, on enseigne la gestion des ménages. Et dans la gestion des ménages, il est enseigné à nous, dans notre culture ici, où c'est très souvent, c'est des cultures où c'est le patriarcat, voilà, on enseigne aux gens le rôle de la femme. Et le rôle que la femme joue dans l'exploitation, qui est déjà existant. Maintenant, l'objectif, le truc, c'est d'emmener les exploitants hommes à comprendre, à véritablement prendre en compte le rôle qui est déjà les leurs, parce que les femmes, c'est pas comme si c'est maintenant que les femmes vont venir s'impliquer, elles sont déjà impliquées. Maintenant, c'est de leur reconnaître ça et puis de vraiment les mettre à leur place qu'il faut, parce qu'elles sont un maillon très fort de la cacaoculture. Aujourd'hui, par exemple, en Côte d'Ivoire, on a une fédération nationale des femmes productrices de cacao. Il y a des coopératives constituées entièrement de femmes productrices de cacao. Voilà, donc elles ont leur rôle. Maintenant, dans le cas des FDP, comme je dis, il y a l'enseignement de la gestion des ménages, de la gestion du genre et tout ça. Donc, tous ces aspects rentrent en compte et qui permettent aussi de réaliser l'importance de la femme dans la cacaoculture. Et voilà, et puis aujourd'hui, grâce à ces coopératives, et il y a de grandes coopératives qui sont dirigées par des femmes. Vous allez à Miyagi, il y a une grande coopérative, ECAM, qui est dirigée par une femme. Il y a la Fédération nationale des femmes et tous ces FDPA peuvent leur être adressés de sorte à ce que, bon, par exemple, comment on appelle ça, dans la façon de véhiculer le message, elles se sentent véritablement spécifiées. Voilà. Sinon, bon, je pense que elles sont déjà prises en compte, mais c'est de vraiment s'attacher ces femmes qui ont déjà ce leadership-là et comme je dis, de servir d'icône, comme M. Paul l'a dit, voilà, ça va tirer, ça sera un peu comme la locomotive qui va tirer un peu les autres femmes à vraiment s'intéresser à tout ça. Maintenant, pour ce qui est des jeunes et tout, il est important, vu que moi-même, je suis un défenseur des jeunes dans tout ce qui est cacaoculture, il est très important qu'on puisse intéresser les jeunes hommes comme femmes. Parce que c'est cela, c'est toutes ces expériences-là qui vont davantage... actuellement, moi, je suis plus dans la préparation de la relève. C'est très important parce que c'est sur ça qu'on doit être vraiment focus, sur la relève. Sur la relève. Parce que, comme je rappelle encore, la moyenne d'âge en Côte d'Ivoire dans la cacaoculture, c'est 43 ans. Et on sait très bien, on sait tous qu'arrivé à un certain âge, on n'est plus efficace dans l'activité qu'est l'agriculture. Donc, c'est la relève et voilà. Donc, pour ce qui est des femmes, il y a vraiment, tout est réuni pour que on puisse vraiment adresser le cas des gens. Parce que même dans l'FDP, le genre est intégré. Pour mon expérience, avec le Nestlé Coco Plan, on a du genre. Et parmi les producteurs élites, il y a des femmes qui sont producteurs élites. Donc, voilà.
Great, thank you very much. This next question relates to climate change. So how do farm development plans incorporate climate change and the rapidly evolving households of cocoa farmers? So I'll just open that up generally to all three panelists to see if any of you have a perspective on how climate change factors into farm development plan creation. Or we can go one at a time as well. Maybe we'll start with Sheila this time. Do you have anything to contribute on how farm development plans incorporate climate change?
Yeah, I wouldn't want to say specifically because that's, again, not my specific area of expertise, but I think, just if we look at the concept of farmer development plans itself, it's about understanding the nature of the farm conditions and building that in. There is a lot of information that it's needed in order for us to think about, how do you ensure that the soil fertility is there, and building these points in, especially now is there is massive amounts of deforestation, and what is that impact on the farm and the fertility of the soil and how that moves forward. These gets taken into account when we look at farmer development plans. So I think it does, it does play a important role. But again, I wouldn't want to claim that I know too much. I think I would rather have one of the other two speakers speak on this.
Fair enough. Thank you. Any other perspectives on how farm development plans incorporate climate change? Jean-Marie or Paul?
On va laisser Paul parler. Je préfère que Paul intervienne d'abord, vu qu'ils ont quand même une expertise au niveau international et tout. Et comme le changement climatique n'est pas local et que c'est toute la Terre qui est impactée, j'aimerais voir un peu de son expérience.
Sure. Thank you, David and Jean-Marie. I would say to the extent that farm development plans are monitoring and making certain assumptions around, I think things Sheila said, rainfall levels, predictability of rainfall patterns, soil fertility, nutrient recycling, and these are all dimensions of climate change. And presumably over time, we would be able to verify whether, you know, the algorithms and the predictive analytics underlying farm development plans accurately capture a rapidly changing environmental context. That's one question. And, you know, it's probably safe to say they don't completely, because the environment is changing so rapidly and so sporadically year on year. It may be very difficult to use those underlying assumptions to evaluate, you know, climatic impacts. However, I do think they point to the need to roll out good agricultural practices that are climate sensitive. Everyone talks about sort of climate smart agriculture and climate smart cocoa. And I think a lot of those messages and methodologies are already out there, and they're being integrated in real time into the curriculum and to the extension training. So I would expect, you know, things like, you know, biodiversity on the farm, greater capture of, you know, organic material, composting that within the soil. Those are all, you know, dimensions of climate smart agriculture that I think would necessarily become part and parcel of the average, you know, extension messaging that's going out there. Where I think it becomes challenging is how do you connect that very micro level, farm level advisory and analytics with global climatic models and, you know, long-term weather impacts. And there, I think there's probably work to be done where we could, you know, build the back end. And here I'm thinking about, you know, sort of big data analytics that help to feed much more sophisticated and informed farm development plans by sourcing information from, you know, NASA and, you know, the European Space Agency and others who are really looking at some of these things. And I think Jean-Marie or Sheila said, you know, the impacts of deforestation can be very localized, especially in precipitation. And so being able to model that and anticipate that is critical. So for me, I think the real question for farm development plans is to what extent can they build in the kind of resilience that we need to see in farming systems going forward, such that there's not a rapid, you know, change in those production levels, so that people, if they're told you do these things, they'll get to a certain level of production that they actually enjoy and realize that level of production. And to do that, we probably need, you know, new recommendations and some updated advisory and extension.
And just to build on that a bit, I think one of the elements of the farm development plan is that whole monitoring system at the farm level. And that would give us a tremendous amount of insights. And even if that's not happening at every farm at every level, if we have enough of this information across a broader level, we'll be able to sort of look at it more from a landscape perspective. That's not fully being realized now, but again, it hasn't been completely rolled out yet, and people are still trying to figure out, you know, what are best ways to do this, what are best ways to sort of monitor and get other layers of data sets that we can add to this. So it does sort of build on that, and hopefully in time, you know, we'll have a better picture of how this actually links up.
So the one-on-one nature of the farm development plans involves a lot of coaching and teaching and mentoring. One of our attendees is asking, is basically positing that the coaching for behavior change that's needed requires more knowledge than the education level of current coaches. And how can we solve this? And just a follow-up to that is, what do you see as being the ideal ratio of farmers to coaches for proper FDP implementation. So maybe we'll go back to you, Sheila.
Okay, again, because I don't have that cocoa experience, I'm not going to speak on the cocoa experience, but just in general, and I've seen this again with palm growers. We had exactly the same situation where, you know, who is providing this sort of coaching to the producers was a big question. There were government extension services, but a lot of them were very young, and the farmers were very old and experienced, and then there was that clash, and who knows what's happening on the farm. So there is, you know, you have to have good agronomists that are able to go on the farm and able to produce this. Within the palm sector, it ultimately landed with the large producing companies that had in-house agronomists that were actually supporting the neighboring producers. So there are many ways that you can bring this sort of personalized coaching. Again, it comes down to just leveraging on what is available and who is there, and really understanding which are the stakeholders that are available there that we can leverage on. And I think that is one thing that we can do.
Jean-Marie, do you have a perspective on the ideal ratio of coaches to farmers, or farmers to coaches?
Et bon, effectivement, par exemple, pour notre expérience ici, c'est que dans un premier temps, le coaching avec le Nestlé Programme, on avait un agronome qui accompagne les élites dans leur exploitation. C'est-à-dire qu'il rend des visites programmées qui lui permettent de pouvoir faire un diagnostic sur certaines réalités agronomiques, vu que, bon, dans les FDP, en règle générale, on donne des informations plus ou moins globales, et il y a des données qui requièrent une plus grande expertise agronomique. Donc, pour notre expérience, par exemple, on menait un ingénieur agronome qui suivait ses producteurs élites dans leur exploitation. Voilà, donc, et à partir de ça, ils pouvaient, comment on appelle ça, résoudre certains problèmes ou bien apporter leur expertise sur certaines réalités constatées. Maintenant, pour pouvoir faire ça à l'échelle, ça requiert aussi un gros investissement. Ben, ce n'est pas évident de mobiliser l'agronome pour un si grand nombre de... Mais je pense que vu que les problèmes, les producteurs sont pris dans différentes localités. Et très souvent, les problèmes qui sont rencontrés, par exemple, je donne mon exemple, moi je suis dans mon exploitation est dans un petit village qui s'appelle Djongobo, et si dans mon exploitation je rencontre certains problèmes agronomiques, par exemple la réalité du shoot and shoot, on sait que c'est quand même un problème que plus sur 10 exploitants, 6 ou 7 pourront rencontrer. Donc, si on me donne des solutions agronomiques avec les certificats agronomes, je peux partager cette solution-là avec mes compères qui sont dans la même zone que moi. Vu que très souvent, les problèmes liés au sol et tout, c'est vraiment lié à la localité. Donc, il y a tous ces aspects-là aussi qui peuvent permettre de réduire le nombre, mais sans toutefois éliminer cette approche-là, parce qu'elle est très importante. Il y a même ici, on pourrait associer, parce qu'il y a par exemple des distributeurs d'engrais qui le font, qui permettent à des producteurs de faire des analyses de sol et tout. Donc, dans le cas des FDP, et comme les FDP requièrent, parce qu'il faut supporter les producteurs, il faut leur apporter des aides et autres, ces aides-là, ça peut être lié à ces différents programmes-là, à joindre ces programmes aux FDP, qui sont par exemple les facilités d'analyse de sol, avec des partenariats, avec des revendeurs d'engrais et tout ça, qui ont la capacité de le faire dans le cadre de leur activité. Donc, tous ces partenariats-là pourront, à la fin, pouvoir profiter aux producteurs à l'échelle. Donc, c'est mon avis.
Great. We have a question about the link between farmer segmentation and farm development plans and whether we have any experiences to share there. Paul, maybe we'll start with you if you have anything to offer on that.
Yeah, I know, and I think Sheila mentioned in her presentation the importance of farmer segmentation. I think it is a critical issue, and one that you know, confronts every company that's trying to differentiate and customize their advisory and support to different categories of farmers. When I was at the World Cocoa Foundation, we had done some work to try and do a segmentation study using a simple survey methodology that the Gateshead Foundation had developed. And what we found after doing it across quite a wide area is we didn't find any really meaningful segments that you know, sort of helped us really inform the kind of support and the needs of individual farmers. So I think while conceptually it makes a lot of sense, I think coming up with those categories is the challenge, and making sure that they're meaningful, and then associating each of those categories with a package of services and support is a challenge. Presumably, you know, at a large scale, if you're doing a lot of the farm development plans with many farmers across a wide area, you eventually could get to a point where you'd be able to segment certain needs, you know, and those segmentations may be, you know, income, they could be farm size, as we've heard already today. They could be age and diversity. I mean, there could be various elements of segmentation that are meaningful, but I just don't think we've gotten the analysis. I wanted to come back though, just quickly, if you don't mind, Dave, on the question of sort of the ideal ratio. I don't think about it so much as the ideal ratio, but the optimal number of touch points between farmers and who's ever developing the plan. So I imagine a situation in which developing those initial farm segmentation plan or farm development plans are pretty intensive. Maybe they require anywhere between 3 and 6 meetings between the person or individual who's helping to develop the plan and the farmer, because, you know, anytime you're planning, you're collecting a massive amount of information, and then you put it into the plan and generate the plans. And then once the plans are in place, presumably you only need to revisit, you know, that farmer once or twice a year at kind of the plan level to determine whether things are on track and what needs to be tweaked. So sort of intensive up front, and then more maintenance going forward. I think that could also be done by different levels of technical sophistication and knowledge. So the initial data collection could be just your average enumerator or extension agent out there. But when you get into more complicated situations, whether it's pest and disease management or you know, replanting, maybe even agroforestry production models and other production systems, you might need a higher level expertise. And so that could be layered and sequenced in a way that's meaningful for the individual farmer and the capabilities of the company.
The next question we have is about farmer groups and FDPs. Specifically, how can a farmer group with more than 2,500 members put in place an effective plan for monitoring? Sheila, you talked quite a bit about monitoring and data in your presentation, so maybe I'll throw this one to you.
Yeah, and I think this comes back to just the program behind it that is able to look at the farm conditions well, and then able to extrapolate, you know, what should be that sort of development plan that goes along with it. So the farmer cooperatives are not expected to do this on their own. I feel there has to be that sort of support system beyond this. And the example that I showed, the one that Rainforest Alliance has, you know, there are many tools that are available that you know, would be able to sort of map out what their plan would look like based on the different types of soil and based on the different types of conditions that are there. So the role of the cooperatives then become more of sort of implementing and coaching and guiding and supporting that system to be implemented rather than having that entire burden placed on them. But again, I do want to also say, you know, it takes for this to be fully realized, it does take time and commitment. And to a certain extent, I've also heard that if you want to see the results, then it goes back to that farmer segmentation. Like, this is about investment into your farms, and the producers themselves also have to take up the practices or the guidance that is being provided and apply them. And this may or may not vary between the different types of farmers that are out there. So it would be good, and I think Jean-Marie had said this, you know, to start with a group of a few and show that it works, because I think this sort of positive reinforcement then makes it better to scale up and show to the other producers that it works.
That makes a lot of sense. We have a few comments about the financing of farmer development plans. So specifically, you know, one question is, with virtually no long-term loans at reasonable interest for farmers in West Africa, how can we solve the challenge of financing a 7-year intervention and potentially even a little bit longer than that, given Sheila's presentation? Maybe we'll start with Jean-Marie. Do you have a perspective on the challenge of financing such a long-term intervention with farmer development plans?
Je veux bien comprendre. C'est le financement de l'implémentation du plan ou c'est ça, c'est ça?
Well, the question really specifies that there's no long-term loans at reasonable interest for farmers in West Africa, and simply asks how we can solve the challenge.
OK. Effectivement, il est très important. Tout à l'heure, on a dit, et je l'ai bien signifié, dans le cas des FDP, le FDP, c'est un plan, c'est différentes informations, c'est le coaching et tout. Mais à la fin, c'est un plan qui est mis en place et ce plan nécessite des investissements dans la parcelle. Et les investissements nécessitent un financement. Et aujourd'hui, en Afrique de l'Ouest, particulièrement dans notre pays, le système financier n'adresse pas de produits spécifiques aux producteurs. Et pour mon expérience, là, je suis membre d'un programme que IDH a mis en place avec le Conseil Café Cacao pour l'accès au financement pour les producteurs et les coopératives, qui est de supporter le CFTech, les agribusiness et les banques en vue d'adresser des produits spécifiques au monde agricole. Et nous avons déjà travaillé plus ou moins dessus. On a même décidé de faire la phase 2. Et il est important. Et aujourd'hui, c'est vrai que nous sommes on a un début, mais on n'a pas encore atteint comment on dit ça, le point on n'a pas encore atteint la vitesse de croisière, parce que la finalité de tout cela, c'est de permettre aux producteurs d'avoir un lien direct avec une institution financière, de pouvoir solliciter un financement et que ce financement lui soit adressé. Ça peut être facilité à travers les coopératives qui peuvent servir d'arrière-garde, voilà, et puis aussi par rapport à l'État lui-même qui peut inciter les banques et les institutions financières à adresser des prêts long terme aux producteurs. Parce que si cela n'existe pas, si cette capacité de financement n'est pas sur la table, les plans de développement vont être enrhumés. Parce que à la fin, si le producteur il décide de faire des investissements dans son champ après avoir pris connaissance de tout ce qui est bonne pratique agricole et tout, et qui n'a pas les moyens d'investir dans son exploitation, tout ce travail en amont aurait été vain. Donc, ici, effectivement, la problématique du financement est très, très importante. C'est dans ce sens-là que j'ai dit qu'avec les FDP, il faut d'autres supports, il faut d'autres appuis qui permettent de créer l'environnement adéquat c'est-à-dire appuyer davantage, essayer d'assainir le secteur financier, encourager le secteur financier à adresser des produits qui tiennent compte des réalités du monde cacao, parce que le cacao produit sur une certaine période, après, s'il y a un vide et tout ça. Donc, c'est tous ces aspects-là tout cet environnement-là qu'il faudra mettre en place. Et dans ce cadre-là, moi, je suis membre du comité de pilotage d'un projet qui travaille sur ce cadre-là. Mais il serait plus intéressant qu'il y ait davantage d'acteurs avec l'État, bien sûr, parce qu'en Côte d'Ivoire, c'est notre production phare. Et dans le monde, je pense que les pays producteurs, les différents États pourraient faciliter cela. Voilà. Donc, c'est vraiment quelque chose qui nous bloque très souvent, l'accès au financement sur le long terme. Bon, maintenant, à petite échelle, la diversification des produits pourrait être une solution à court terme. Mais sur le long terme, c'est intéressant que les banques puissent adresser des produits qui répondent vraiment à cette problématique.
And sorry, if I could just add on to what Jean-Marie was saying, you know, this question of who comes in to support on this, it has been a question for a long time now. And we had also initiated these kind of discussions within the community of practice. And so it was a question back to the finance community as well, the investment community. You know, what do you need to see in order to be able to invest in these kind of programs? Is the information, you know, what is the information that is needed for them to be able to say, yes, we're going to invest in this program or in this group of farmers and so forth? And actually understanding what these indicators are that they want to see, and then working with the cooperatives and building these farmer development plans to be able to produce these kind of indicators, I think is also very important. So it's not just saying we're going to have farm development plans that, you know, just focus on productivity per se as one thing, but really just looking at what are different indicators that will also enable investors to say, yes, you know, we want and we're comfortable to invest in this community, or we're able to invest in this. So I think that's one thing that we have to look into, is just what are these different indicators that are needed to enable the finance community and the investment community to also come in and be able to support.
And we have a question specifically for you, Sheila, asking about the non-cocoa elements of farmer development plans, such as income diversification, which we're chatting about, and improved energy solutions for households. Do we have any experience on how to build those types of things into the FDP process?
Yeah, and again, you know, the farmer development plan, and I think Jean-Marie had touched on this, it is to say, you know, we are looking at beyond just the primary crop. You know, we are looking at household income, and we've already talked about the multiple components of it. There are many diversification type programs that are out there. And, you know, I think the question that we're asking, and we want to be clear, is it's not just saying, go and diversify if, you know, if cocoa is not going to be possible, you know, what are other crops you can do too. We also have to be careful that we're not sending farmers into another sort of zone where there's no uptake for those crops, you know. So if we ask them to go and plant something else, is there going to be a market for it? Is that going to be taken up? And, you know, will this actually support in that long-term plan? So diversification is great, and there are many programs out there already looking into it, but I think to couple it and make sure that it's effective, we have to also look at, you know, what is the uptake like, and how that works within that context. So you can't look at it in isolation on its own.
Thank you. I really like this next question, and I'm going to direct this one to you, Paul. Basically, we're saying there are a lot of concepts in farmer development plans that make sense. The theory of change is convincing, but what data is there on what works and what doesn't? So what is our evidence basis around farm development plans?
Yeah, you can hear me. I'm muted. Yeah, that's a great question. And thank you for that. You know, as I was saying, I think, at least from what I've seen, many companies are starting to experiment with farm development plans and roll them out. And we've heard from you know, several companies that have used them. What I don't think we've necessarily been able to work out is how do we take that sort of proprietary company level data and create an analytical framework that would allow us to, you know, answer some of these key questions like frequency, cost, impact and effectiveness versus cost. And I think it's only when we come up with a system or a method by which, you know, I think as Sheila was saying, that we can share some of this data, that we can begin to really evaluate it. I mean, the other approach obviously would be, and Dave, I'm sure you could talk about this, you know, setting up a really, you know, sort of gold standard evaluation, and inviting companies to, you know, submit several of their farm development plan participants into a sort of randomized control trial that really looks at the impact of farm development plans across, you know, a whole variety of situations and farmers, and potentially even compares, you know, the impact of farm development plans with more traditional farmer field schools and other support plans.
Absolutely. It's such a comprehensive program that a robust program evaluation like that would certainly would be nice to see. One of the challenges, of course, is always going to be the time course of measuring the impact, but there are ways around that as well.
And I do want to say, you know, there is a lot of data already being collected, and some organizations are making that available, and that is what we can use to sort of build this discussion. So again, just having a space where we're able to share this, because this is the time where we do want to see, you know, does this work, does this not? And yes, there is that whole time element for it. So really, if we can get more in terms of sharing, I think that would be really useful.
One of the challenges with farm development plans is this tension between looking for farmers who are more likely to adopt and maintain adherence to the development program versus those who could benefit the most in terms of their yields. And one question we have from attendees is, do we know of any ways to identify early adopters and who are more likely to react and benefit from farm development plans? And maybe we'll go to you, Paul, on that one.
Yeah, thank you. And my apologies, everyone. I do have to drop off very soon here, but excellent question from Pierre. I think, you know, for me, the predictors of adoption and uptake or early uptake is not that dissimilar from what we've seen in other technologies or other solutions, that there are always some farmers who are willing to, you know, take the risk and take up a new technology and approach and give it a try. And in many cases, you know, they may be younger, they may have a perspective on the long-term horizon for their farm that is different from other farmers. You know, those business-oriented farmers who already are engaged in the market and actively looking to manage their farm as a business are probably much more likely to take up these approaches. You know, even farmers who are willing to, you know, aggressively prune their trees and cut down old trees and rehabilitate their trees, you know, that's a minority especially in West Africa. And so, you know, perhaps that cohort of farmers would be more likely to take up a farm development plan or their cooperatives.
Thank you, Paul. And in the interest of time, we're running out very quickly here. I want to just give attendees an opportunity to make any comments that they would like to the speakers or ask any final questions. If you'd like to make a comment or ask a question, you could briefly unmute yourself to do so. So I'll just give everyone a few seconds to do that.
I'm just speaking. I just want to thank everybody. It was a great discussion, great presentation. So thanks a bunch.
And I will echo that as well. And Paul, I know you have to drop off. We thank you very much for teaching us about FDPs and for your talk. So thank you very much. And I also want to thank Sheila and Jean-Marie for their discussion, their perspectives, and their presentations, which were also very interesting. I hope that everyone who's attended the session learned a lot about farm development plans. I think the questions that you've asked are very insightful, and I very much enjoyed the session as well. At this point, I'll turn it back to Virginie, our session host.
Thank you very much, David. Thank you to our speakers. I'm trying to find my last slide. Here we go. So we are really, really happy for being able to have this session. What can I say? I will just say thank you once more to our moderator and our speakers, because they have been great on this very exciting, very interesting topic of farm development plans in the relation with what is getting increasing interest, namely the living income. So thank you so much. Thank you for the very great discussion. I hope the audience really enjoyed as I did. I also want to thank our sponsor, the sponsor of this our very first virtual partnership meeting. I hope you enjoyed this new format. We are very happy we have been able to organize that. So thank you especially to our gold sponsor, Panelists. I also want to thank our participants. I see that we are almost more than 20 people, and at some point we were almost 30 participants. So thank you very much for your participation to those 2 hours of discussion. So before we close, I would like to share with you that the meeting platform will be open in the coming days, so the coming weeks. So you can go on the platform, and only on demand you will receive the session that you are willing to receive. So we can also continue to interact with to do some networking with other participants. So I will just say thank you once more, and please enjoy the rest of your day or your night, and see you soon on the platform or in other meetings. Thank you very much to our moderator. He did great. And thanks a lot to our chat moderator, Nene, and to you all. Thank you very much, and see you soon. Goodbye.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
All right.
Thanks, Virginie. Bye.